Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, as the case may be. Welcome to the third session of Rembrandt Seen Through Jewish Eyes, the webinar in preparation for the exhibition of the same title, to open in the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow in October of this year. My name is Gary Schwartz. With Mirjam of the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam, I'm guest curator of the exhibition and moderator of the symposium. 2 weeks ago, the event opened with a keynote speech by Simon Schama, who spoke insightfully on British Jewish artists, especially David Bomberg, who responded to Rembrandt in their own work. Mirjam took us on an instructive walk through Rembrandt's neighborhood, introducing us to his patrons and fellow artists, and his Jewish neighbors. Bartolet gave an illuminating expose on the Ashkenazi community, whose members also lived in the streets around Rembrandt's house. Last week was devoted to spiritual values that united and divided Rembrandt and the Jews. Michael Zell spoke on the diversity of the ethnic and cultural environment of Rembrandt's Amsterdam, how the artist responded to it, and what this means to us and our own contemporaries. Steve Nadler brought us up to date on the latest knowledge concerning the two Amsterdam Jews most often connected to Rembrandt, Manasseh ben Israel and Spinoza. Shelley Perlove, who has written more about our subject than anyone, offered a point-by-point analysis of the main issues regarding Rembrandt and the Jews. The talks were followed by a roundtable discussion between the speakers in that session and the others. Today, too, a discussion like that will be held. In it, your own questions can be introduced, so don't be shy about typing questions into the chat at the bottom of your screen. It's time for the talks on Jews in the art world and Rembrandt. I'm the first speaker. In the first session, I introduced myself, and I won't do it again. Those of you who missed it can watch it on the recording that has been placed by the museum on YouTube with a link I'll be putting on my own website, the Schwartz list. The subject I have taken on concerns Jewish collectors of work by Rembrandt. What I have found is that through to the 20th century and its end, the collectors were all affected to one degree or another by the anti-Semitism in their countries and the double-edged associations of Rembrandt and Judaism. Let me start by impressing on you the significance of Jewish ownership of Rembrandt paintings for the study of Rembrandt in general. Some of his most important paintings, including the 4 most expensive old masters ever sold, belong to Jewish owners. These are not only the 3 famous full-length figures from the Rothschild collection, let's leave out the maybe Leonardo Salvator Mundi, but also Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer, which was the most expensive painting ever sold in 1961 when it was put on the auction block in New York. In my research, I have found 70 or so Jewish owners of work by Rembrandt. The connection between their Jewishness and their collecting habits is not always evident, and I do not want to assign motives to them they do not acknowledge, at least not much. In the essay I'm writing for the publication accompanying the exhibition, I will be looking at all of these collectors, but for today's talk, I will be concentrating on those for whom art collecting was clearly related to their being Jewish. I'm not going to be particular about who went to synagogue and who converted to Christianity. For the sake of time, I will also be leaving out persons about whom others and myself have already written, such as Alfonso Lopez, who bought his Rembrandt directly from the artist in 1639, or Rudolf Kahn, whose painting of a young Jew in the Kimball Art Museum is the best one there is. It came as a surprise to me, and I'm willing to bet all of you, that these two late Rembrandt portraits, which did not command proper appreciation from connoisseurs until the later 20th century, were bought in the mid-18th century by a prominent British Jew, a Sephardi financier and banker in London named Samson Gideon. With one of the largest fortunes in Britain, Gideon was the financial power behind the throne itself. In 1745, he raised £1 million to help the Hanoverian Whig government suppress a revolution by supporters of the Scottish Stuarts. That did not spare him the ignominy of being satirized for his Jewishness when, in 1753, an aborted attempt was made to pass a law allowing Jews to become naturalized British citizens. Above is a satirical print of that year, ridiculing the campaign. Gideon's hopes for recognition at the high level he felt he deserved came to naught. As Simon Schama wrote, notwithstanding its obligations to him, the quality looked at Gideon and saw the costly, pretentious stock jobber of the exchange and passed him over. Art collecting and patronage was a way for Samson Gideon, using only the money and taste at his disposal, to match the quality on its own terms. This practice was adopted and expanded by his son, also named Samson, who was an Anglican and gained the peerage denied to his father. I'm not sure whether Samson Gideon, the son, in Rome 5 years after his father's death, did not sit for Pompeo Bartoni in the pose in which his father had been ridiculed, but I can't resist illustrating it as a possibility. Samson Gideon was called the Rothschild of his day, and the Rothschilds of their day, days extending from 1836 to the present, were, taken as a family conglomerate, the principal Jewish collectors of Rembrandt paintings and etchings, including Edmond de Rothschild. When in 1836, the London art dealer John Smith published his first catalog of Rembrandt's paintings, he listed only one owned by a Jewish collector, belonging to Baron James Mayer de Rothschild. The table I will be publishing in my essay includes about 15 members of the family with their Rembrandt paintings. Concerning the question of whether the Rothschilds may have associated their collecting of Rembrandt with being Jewish, I have the great good fortune of being able to consult a present member of the family. Erich de Rothschild was kind enough to answer my direct question in this matter. "Dear Mr. Schwartz," he said, "I have no recollection of any specific Jewish approach to Rembrandt in my family. The collected art was very diverse, but always trying to get the best. It was, I am sure, at that time, both between family members and also other collectors, very competitive, and what was higher on the scale than Rembrandt. Some of the family members were more eclectic and bought, I think, up to 10 Chardins at a time when he was not à la mode. Yours sincerely, and sorry not to be of much help, but he was, E.R. Erich de Rothschild." I cannot doubt this, but even if Baron James Mayer was not thinking of a Jewish connection when he bought the Standard Bearer in 1840, it already was a prominent part of Rembrandt's image. Look only at these pages in John Smith's volume on Rembrandt of 1836. Uniquely in his catalogue of Dutch and Flemish paintings, its 9 volumes, he devotes an entire section of his indexes to Rembrandt's, quote, "portraits of Jews and rabbis." The Rembrandt literature was to be endowed with another quotable quote in those years, when in 1854, the German writer and political activist Eduard Koloff wrote of Rembrandt's biblical figures that they displayed a strong touch of the Judaic. Judelei. What may have been a relatively innocuous remark in 1856 became by 1890 an instrument of vicious anti-Semitism. Ingeniously, the perceived tie between Rembrandt and the Jews was now interpreted to the credit of Rembrandt and the vilification of the Jews. Rembrandt came to stand for a model of the Nordic spirit, a true German of the blood. This notion was propagated in a tractate of unequaled popularity that was first published in 1890 and was reprinted more than 100 times through to the end of the Third Reich. The title itself was legendary, Rembrandt als Erzieher, Rembrandt as teacher. The author signed not with his name, which was Julius Langbein, but von einem Deutschen, by a German, claiming to represent Germanness itself. Writing about Rembrandt's relation to Jews, Langbein draws a distinction between praiseworthy Rembrandt Jews and the contemptible Jews of Langbein's own time. Quote, in the final result, Rembrandt's nobility shows itself, weirdly enough, in his predilection for Jews. A genuine Jew who adheres to the old faith has something unmistakably noble about him. He belongs to the age-old moral and spiritual aristocracy from which most modern Jews have taken their leave. Rembrandt's Jews were real Jews who wanted to be nothing but Jews, which gave them character. The opposite is true of almost all Jews today who want to be German, English, French, whatever, making them characterless. And nothing is worse than lack of character. It is the crime of crimes, the sin against the Holy Spirit, individualism, and unforgivable. This was the spirit of the day when, in 1897, the upper crust of Jewish Berlin banded to help found an elite civil institution, very expensive to join, the still extant and active Kaiser Friedrich Museumsverein, a society of patrons to the leading museum of northern Germany and one of the leading museums of Europe. In 2018, a bit on the late side, the Verein published a small book of capsule biographies of its Jewish members. In it, we read that at the end of the 1920s, the society had about 120 members. Of the 120, 70 were Jewish. Many of them founding members from 1897 on. 58% in a country where Jews constituted less than 1% of the population. Plainly, the Verein served as a vehicle by which wealthy Jews, without needing the approval of a sometimes hostile social milieu, could participate in the higher realms of German culture. To give you an idea of the quality level at which members collected, with the advice of the museum director Wilhelm von Bode, this slide of 3 Rembrandt paintings owned by 2 of the members, now proud possessions of 3 great American museums, tells enough. It also illustrates the tendency of Jewish collectors to stay away from subjects with Christian theological messages. In my essay, I will talk more about the themes they collected. There is one donation in particular that I want to talk about, a donation that represents an iconic moment in the theme of our conference and exhibition, and about which we have exceptionally detailed information, to which I was guided by Katja Kleinert, curator of Dutch and Flemish painting in the Berlin Gemäldegallery. In the 1890s, a major Jewish art collector, Rodolphe Kahn, a Frankfurt-born Frenchman, bought this head of Christ in Paris. After Kahn's death, his entire collection was bought in 1907 for $4.5 million by one of the leading galleries and old masters, Duveen Brothers, a Jewish firm. This was front-page news all over the world. From Duveen, the head of Christ was bought for £2,000 by the Hamburg entrepreneur Martin Blomberg and his wife Eleanor, or Laura. Laura was the sister of the deceased Rodolphe Kahn, so that the couple knew very well what they were buying. They bought it, however, not for themselves. The painting never went to Hamburg, On December 17, 1907, the Bromberg signed a paper by which they donated it to the Kaiser Friedrich Museum in Berlin. On December 21, 1907, it was sent by train from Paris to Berlin, where on February 6, 1908, it was inscribed in the museum books at an evaluation of 20,500 marks. In the museum, the painting took its place in a corner of one of the Dutch galleries, which we see here in a photo taken in 1917. This display is a veritable paean to Jewish subject matter, Jewish patronage, and Jewish collecting. The two large paintings show the virtuous and clever young biblical heroes, Daniel and Joseph, both of whom rise to high court positions in foreign countries without abandoning their religion. It was happenstance that they were in the collection, but their placing calls attention to the success of smart Jews in mighty kingdoms, Daniel in Cyrus's Persia, Joseph in the Egypt of the Pharaohs, with overtones of the Jewish grandees in the Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm. Two of the smaller paintings show a young and an old man, both seen as Jews, the old man as the patriarch Jacob. Jewish patronage is exemplified by the man in the golden helmet in the upper left and the portrait of a young Jew in the lower tier. These were two of the very first paintings acquired by the Kaiser Friedrich Museumsverein, the young Jew in 1896 and the man with the golden helmet in 1897. They are still property of the Verein, which keeps its paintings and puts them on permanent loan to the museum. Jewish collecting would have been apparent to anyone in the know. Christ and the Woman of Samaria on the lower left, and the head of Christ were from the collection of Rudolf Kahn, the latter as a donation of the Brombergs. Both came in on the same train from Paris. Although Martin Bromberg was not a member of the Verein, he too consulted Bode on his purchases. The Bromberg donation embodied an implicit, mutually beneficial link between the upper reaches of German culture and Jewish philanthropy, with Rembrandt and Jesus serving as interdenominational tokens of the bond. I repeat, Rembrandt and Jesus. Jewish patronage was not an effective antidote to anti-Semitism. While Wilhelm von Bode and his museum were benefiting from Jewish gifts, he also devoted a long, critical, but appreciative review on Langbane's book, Rembrandt als Erzieher, in a prestigious journal, without referring to the author's outright anti-Semitism. There is an undocumented but persistent rumor that Bode introduced Langbane to Chancellor Bismarck, who was Langbane's foremost idol of present-day Germanists, as Rembrandt was the greatest German of past times. Speaking of which, I cannot withhold from you this funny comparison. My dear departed colleague Martin Branke suggested that Bode's eagerness to let Berlin Jews pay for the man with the golden helmet was not unrelated to its resemblance to the Iron Chancellor himself. Bode was playing on everyone's feelings while making himself indispensable to all. Following the Shoah, it is easy to forget that European anti-Semitism was more rampant and more socially discriminating in France than in Germany, and that it spread more virulently into judgments concerning art and collectors. Preceding the Dreyfus affair, but preparing the ground for it, was an extraordinary, highly acclaimed, and phenomenally successful book of 1886, La France Juive, by Edouard Drummond. The aim of this two-volume, 1,200-page tome was to make France great again by excising the dire, all-pervasive Jewish influence that had corrupted the pure French race. This had to do with aesthetics as well as everything else. Semites lack the power of creation, Drummond wrote. They subsist by exploiting the inventions of the Aryans. In Drumon's dream of a France rid of Jews, Rembrandt has his part to play. It's Rembrandt that one must, I would not say look at, but contemplate, study, scrutinize, search, analyze, if we really want to see the Jew. Rembrandt was always living among Israel. His studio itself resembled those shops of second-hand goods, in the back of which the disoriented eye finally catches sight of a sordid old man with a hooked nose. His work has a Jewish color. It is yellow, in that intense warm yellow that seems like the reflection of gold playing on an old yellow badge from the Middle Ages, forgotten in a corner. How much anti-Semitism can you build into a few sentences? In such a toxic environment, we cannot but take special notice of the burst of collecting activity in this period among wealthy French Jews. Between 1883 and 1908, the catalogued ownership of Rembrandt paintings in this group rose from 10 paintings owned by 6 collectors to 34 owned by 13. In the same year as the Kaiser Friedrich Museumsverein was founded, a parallel effort was undertaken in Paris with the establishment of the Société des Amis du Louvre. This body is framed differently than the Verein, more popular than elite. In the late 1920s, it numbered nearly 3,000 members. Were the Société to publish a book on its Jewish members, they would surely not have been in the majority, but their impact would have been highly visible. In 1913, the chairmanship was actually offered to Isaac de Camondo, of the Camondo Efroussi clan made famous by Edmond de Waal. Camondo, who had made a donation of 808 works to the Louvre, turned the honor down because it was accompanied by an anti-Semitic slur. In the new book by James Macaulay, The House of Fragile Things, Jewish Art Collectors and the Fall of France, the author's analysis of the situation of French Jewish collectors is trenchant and very much to the point. Quote, "There may not have been anything significantly Jewish about the art and the collections they amassed, but the donations they made and the museums they left behind were subtle attempts to respond to the anti-Semitism of the fin de siècle, to show that Jews could indeed curate a genuine, authentic image of France and shape its national patrimony. The bequests these collectors made also became political statements, arguments in favor of the eternal compatibility of Frenchness and Jewishness." Jews who thought that their collecting was winning them approval from all French art lovers were deceiving themselves. After the death of Rodolphe Kahn's brother Maurice, when in 1909 his collection was put up for auction, was commented on by a prominent French art historian, Louis Dimier. He wrote an article in the right-wing anti-Semitic journal L'Action Française with the title Les Collections Juives. Taste in art is fundamentally foreign to the formation of these collections. In the Jewish collection, and I'm talking about the best ones, there is in general nothing more than a need for dealing, some mercantile savoir-faire, knowledge of superficialities. That's all there is to it, that's all. As for those who buy Rembrandt, they think of themselves as performing a great deed. They appear to themselves as serious people, protectors of the arts, even thinkers and philosophers. Rembrandt is admirable, and there is enough taste in the world to preserve him for sincere art lovers. But I assure you that they are not the ones buying Kahn's Rembrandts. These were picked up in the flea market and are being sold to snobs. Jewish collecting of Rembrandt, in sum, cannot be seen merely or mainly as an exercise of taste. The collectors knew that they were entering into a high-stakes game of art marketing and social, religious, and ethnic contention, as well as history and connoisseurship, a game in which they looked like expert players to some and cheaters to others. in Germany and France, where this collecting largely took place, only the Rothschilds can be said to have won the game. The rest of the collectors who figure in this history are American. In America, as in Europe, art collecting afforded a means to generate a social distinction that one had in one's own hands. The immediate buyer of the Maurice Kahn collection was once more Duveen Brothers for $3 million. Among the American millionaires who were their clients was the New York department store owner Benjamin Altman, the foremost Jewish American collector of his time, who upon his death in 1913 bequeathed 13 Rembrandts to the Metropolitan Museum of Art as part of the largest single donation ever received by the museum. Illustrated are 10 of the paintings in the bequest. While most of these are no longer accepted as by Rembrandt, although they were really famous at the time, like the woman clipping her fingernails, this does not diminish the significance of the bequest in its time. A man, by all accounts, a self-effacing man, who would not have been admitted to a men's club or athletic society in New York, was able to put his name on a gallery in the city's foremost museum. Collecting by wealthy businessmen tends to be contagious. The Rothschilds inspired imitative behavior by some of those who worked for them in banking and finance, like Jules Porges. Another nexus of the kind were the mainly British dealers in diamonds and gold, like the Beitz and Max Michaelis, making their fortune in South Africa. Benjamin Altman, too, inspired his successor at B. Altman and Company to collect art. For Michael Friedsam, art collecting fit into larger moral and even spiritual values. He bequeathed his fortune and estate, which included one Rembrandt workshop painting, mainly to educational institutions, notably the Franciscan St. Bonaventure University. This compliment to Christianity by a Jew, like that of Martin Bromberg, was intended to foster goodwill that was not always reciprocated. At St. Bonaventure, it was, I'm happy to say. The painting has been granted for a loan to our exhibition. Although no private collector after the Second World War was able to acquire Rembrandt paintings of the quality and importance of those that were inherited by the Rothschilds from their 19th century forebears, it is striking in the context of Rembrandt seen through Jewish eyes that so many of the most dedicated collectors of Rembrandt and Rembrandt school paintings and drawings of the post-war period are Jewish. Only bit by bit were they able to collect on terms that were not a response to anti-Semitism. This proceeded well into the second half of the 20th century. In a class of his own was the late Alfred Bader. To this chemist, inventor, businessman, philanthropist, volunteer teacher at a Jewish Sunday school, art collector, art dealer, donor of art, and sponsor and supporter of art history with curatorships and professorships in Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. To this man, being Jewish and collecting Rembrandt were guiding passions. He puts it into as many words in one of his memoirs, Adventures of a Chemist Collector. In this passage, he writes that his desire to own a particular Rembrandt Trony of a Jew was sparked by a lecture of Jacob Rosenberg's at Harvard in the 1940s, in which Rosenberg spoke of that painting as an example of Rembrandt's sympathy with the Jews. Let me show you the Tronies that Rosenberg published as such in his book on Rembrandt of 1948, here in the second edition of 1973. The painting to which Bader was referring is the one on the right, from the Erickson collection. But the other one, then in a private collection in France, is another of Rosenberg's examples, of which he wrote that they embody, quote, patriarchal dignity, while expressing, quote, a stubborn tenacity of character, along with an intellectual gift for casuistic argumentation. Bader might have recognized himself too, as I do, in this characterization. And now let me show you two of Bader's later acquisitions. Look at that. What makes this example exceptional are only two things: that the collector embraced Jewishness publicly and prominently, and that he put into words Rembrandt's attraction to him for the artist's sympathy with Jews, not only in his book, but also in a lecture that he delivered widely. As I see it, the attraction is there for most or all Jewish collectors of Rembrandt, even if it is not made explicit or is foremost in their minds. I met Jacob Rosenberg once, around 1977. He came to talk to me about the new edition of the book on Lucas Cranach that he had written in 1932 with Max Friedlander, in the preparation of which I was involved as a publisher. Allow me to stand still for a moment at this fact. In 1932, only weeks before the initiation of the Third Reich, the director of the Kaiser Friedrich Museum, Max Friedlander, Are you seeing this Google Drive in the middle of the screen? All right. In 1932, immediately before the initiation of the Third Reich, the director of the Kaiser Friedrich Museum, Max Friedlander, and the head of the Department of Prints and Drawings, Jacob Rosenberg, were both Jewish. This situation was unthinkable anywhere else in the world, certainly not in the United States, for half a century from that time. This only adds to the unimaginable bitterness of what was to follow in that country of all countries. The subject of the collaboration of Friedlander and Rosenberg augments the pain. The artist to whom they dedicated a monograph that has never been replaced, Lucas Cranach, was the most German of artists, the artistic partner of Luther himself. The Luther monograph, the Cranach monograph of 1932, reverberates to much the same notes as Martin Blomberg's donation of a Rembrandt head of Christ to the very same museum. Rosenberg was brought to my house by another Jewish Rembrandt collector who, like Alfred Bader, was inspired by Rosenberg's scholarship and humaneness, and who is also a supporter of art history and curatorship, as well as a major donor of art to museums. That was George Abrams. I show him in this beautiful photograph of himself with his beloved wife, Maida, who died in 2002 at a sadly young age, and whose name is forever linked with his in the collection that is always called the Maida and George Abrams collection. Asked directly, as I did, whether the fact of his being Jewish has anything to do with his collecting, George denies it, and I have to believe him. He is an exemplar of the Rembrandt collector who just happens to be Jewish, but who I think nonetheless has warm feelings for Rembrandt for that reason. For the exhibition, he is lending us a lovely portrait that might well be by Rembrandt and may well be of a Jewish woman. The final Jewish collectors to whom I wish to draw attention merit special interest. Thomas Kaplan and his wife, Daphne Recanati Kaplan, have brought together over the past 20 years a sizable collection of museum-quality Dutch paintings of the 17th century, including more Rembrandts than any now owned by a single private collector. The Kaplans have made the collection available for display worldwide. I've seen outstanding exhibitions of the Dow paintings in the Lakenhal Museum in 2014 and in 2017 of 31 Dutch paintings in the Louvre. From there, the Louvre exhibition went on to Russia in the Hermitage and the Pushkin Museum, to China in Shanghai and Beijing, and to the Louvre Abu Dhabi. For the Kaplans, the Leiden collection complements a range of philanthropic activities in wildlife and culture. This adds conviction to Tom's statements about the spiritual dimension of his enterprise, with roots in Kabbalah. In closing, let me quote the most pertinent statement by a Jewish collector of how he sees Rembrandt. In a speech at the opening ceremony of the exhibition of the Leiden collection in the Louvre, Tom Kaplan said, "While art that touches the soul may not alone be able to save the world, perhaps Rembrandt has a tangible role to play in what the Jews call tikkun olam, repairing the world. Daphne and I will happily take that as a first step," end quote. May there be many more steps to follow. See you later to talk about that paper, I hope. Our next speaker is Larry Silver. Larry is the James and Nan Wagner Farquhar Professor Emeritus of History of Art at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Although he is years younger than I, it seems as if I have known and admired him forever. He is a prominent presence in the organizations of art history, having served as president of both the College Art Association and Historians of Netherlandish Art, the largest bodies of their kind in the world. As fellow students of Netherlandish art, we have long shared much of the same turf, always with mutual respect, which is sadly not always the case. But Larry has done important work in other fields as well, most particularly in connection with our webinar on Jewish art. Today, he will be looking at the most moving of the phenomena in our theme, the way one Jewish artist after another found in Rembrandt a kindred spirit. Larry.
Thank you very much, Gary. Let me share my screen so you don't have to look at me. First of all, I want to say what an honor it is to participate with such a distinguished cluster of colleagues. And I want to offer special thanks to Gary Schwartz, to Mirjam Knotter, and to Leah Chechik for making this possible through the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow. Jews did not aspire to be artists who painted at easels until the early era of emancipation in the 19th century. And as numerous scholars of Dutch art historiography have noted, even Rembrandt himself had endured a modest eclipse in his reputation until about the same moment. But then he recovered his canonical status again, beginning with the Romantic era. Ever afterwards, he has been acclaimed as a powerful, independent painter of human individuality and inner life, as well as a painter of unadorned daily life for which Dutch art was generally celebrated across the 19th century. Part of Rembrandt's rehabilitation for Jewish artists stemmed from his allegedly sympathetic attitude toward his Jewish neighbors around the St. Anthony Braestraat in Amsterdam, as we learned in the first week from Mirjam Knotter. During the same 19th century, many paintings in Rembrandt's style surfaced with little corroborating provenance to show thoughtful, bearded philosophers. These men were often construed during the 19th century Rembrandt revival as rabbis, a claim that has been repeatedly debunked by current Rembrandt scholars. This misreading happened so often that during a 2006 exhibition debunking the myth of the so-called Jewish Rembrandt, Edward van Vollen harshly dismissed the entire picture group with these words, and I quote, "Not all shabbily dressed men with fur hats or turbans need necessarily be Jews. There were sufficient immigrants in Amsterdam to attract Rembrandt's attention," end quote. Nevertheless, the same positive spin about Rembrandt's relationships to Amsterdam's Jews persisted across the 19th century and well into the 20th century, even in the work of two acclaimed scholars, German Jews themselves who had emigrated to the United States, Erwin Panofsky and Franz Landsberger. The latter's book, Rembrandt, the Jews and the Bible, appeared as recently as 1946 and was discussed last week by Michael Zell. Thus, we can imagine what kind of a model Rembrandt provided for at least one aspiring young Jewish painter in Poland during the 1870s. Moritz Gottlieb lived but a short time, but was productive as well as influential, and he worked hard to establish his Jewish identity in his art. A protege of Poland's leading history painter Jan Matejko at the Krakow Academy, Gottlieb began his career at a time when Polish painting chiefly represented Jews as picturesque stereotypes of ghetto life. By contrast, Gottlieb's ambitions, like Rembrandt's own, included ambitious history paintings, chiefly biblical subjects, but also subjects about Jews from canonical works of literature, notably Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice and Lessing's Nathan the Wise. Significantly, among Gottlieb's large-scale paintings are New Testament biblical scenes where he depicted Jesus expressly as a Jew. This is the first of two images that stand out. It's a vast canvas left unfinished that depicts Jesus at the Sanhedrin before his judges, now in the Israel Museum. This is from Matthew 16, Mark 14, and John 18, about the setting of the Sanhedrin. And at the center, a bearded, dark-haired Jesus is markedly Jewish in his costume. He has a talit or prayer shawl and a kippah or skull cap with side curls, and his white garment is the Jewish robe-like kittel, a loose white surplice worn on solemn occasions and eventually used by the observant as a burial garment. Around Jesus, various older bearded men, akin to those numerous rabbis then ascribed to Rembrandt, are attending as observers. Meanwhile, the high priest Caiaphas, wearing the breastplate of Aaron from Exodus, sits opposite the prisoner Jesus with his throne backed by an outstretched open Torah at the upper left. Its 10 commandments are in accurately rendered Hebrew and feature the key initial stricture, "You shall have no other gods before me." Into this scene, Gottlieb has even inserted his own self-portrait. I don't know if you can see my cursor. He is presenting himself as a witness located directly behind Jesus at the right center. Rembrandt's 1636 etching of Christ before Pilate certainly provided a precedent for this passion scene, which focuses on Pilate's presentation of the scourged Jesus before a hostile crowd, including costumed Jews in the very foreground. Rembrandt also provides accurate Jewish details. He has inserted accurately rendered Hebrew letters on talit prayer shawls as worn over their hats by the Sephardic Jews of Amsterdam. In fact, this is the daily prayer, the Kiryat Shema from Deuteronomy 6. Such a detail, even when used for a hostile Jewish crowd, could certainly convince a Jew like Moritz Gottlieb about Rembrandt's personal engagement with his surrounding Jewish culture, despite his own commitment to represent a Christian religious narrative. Thus, when representing his own version of New Testament narrative in the Sanhedrin, Gottlieb also included Jewish religious dress and Torah scrolls for his insider touch of authenticity within the same kind of biblical painting that dominated 19th century ambitions. Gottlieb's other large-scale New Testament subject, now in Warsaw, and also clearly unfinished, depicts Jesus preaching at the synagogue at Capernaum. Once more, the Jewish Jesus is wearing a tallis around his waist as he preaches with an open Torah scroll on the bima or lectern. Here, however, a halo's golden glow surrounds his head, suggesting that Gottlieb was also trying to reach the dominant Catholic audience in his native Poland. And the great thing about studying more recent artists than Rembrandt is that they give us their own words. Gottlieb declared in a letter to a friend from a trip in Rome in 1878 the following words: "How deeply I wish to eradicate all the prejudices against my people. How avidly I desire to uproot the hatred enveloping the oppressed and tormented nation and to bring peace between the Poles and the Jews, for the history of both people is a chronicle of grief and anguish." Once more, Gottlieb includes himself down below within the congregation, and also true to Jewish synagogue custom, Gottlieb shows an isolated women's gallery above and behind the main sanctuary. The latter half of the 19th century made a concerted turn toward a historical image of the human Jesus. And consequently, like Rembrandt, Gottlieb portrayed a believably human, now distinctly Jewish Jesus. But how could he even have known his Rembrandt models? For Gottlieb and his contemporaries, the answer lies in the 19th century convergence between photolithographic reproduction technology and an emerging art publishing industry. Already during Gottlieb's lifetime, standardized series of illustrated art books devoted to the works of single canonical masters began to appear in all the languages of Europe, and Rembrandt was among the first Northern artists to be published. These artists, particularly Renaissance Italian masters, were also precisely the same figures celebrated and imitated in art academies where Gottlieb and others were studying. The next outstanding Polish-Jewish artist, also short-lived, is Samuel Hirschenberg. Like Gottlieb, Hirschenberg also studied at the art academies in Krakow and Munich. He too drew on Rembrandt, but as you see here, he sometimes focused on his 17th century Dutch surroundings, such as this very memorable image of Spinoza excommunicated. It's now in Kurst from 1907. Here, the beardless Spinoza, dressed in period Dutch costume, is lost in thought as he walks with a book, unaware that a group of other Jewish men stop and stare at him. They fear any contact with the heretic because under his excommunication, they are obliged to shun him from the community. An additional irony appears here and is surely deliberate on Hirschenberg's part. It's the number of that group of men on the right side, 9 men. So Spinoza's presence, or that of the figure on the left, would otherwise make a minyan, a prayer group requiring 10 male adults, according to Jewish law. One of the men near the center is actually bending down to grab a stone and hurl it at the absorbed, strolling philosopher. That 10th man, isolated at the left, is hesitating. Perhaps he's in an intellectual or moral dilemma, which Hirschenberg might use to suggest sympathy with the tranquil philosopher, who is sometimes considered, as we heard last week from Stephen Nadler, as the harbinger of modern emancipated Judaism. Hirschenberg would eventually emigrate to Palestine in 1907, but his last dark paintings, I skipped one, from Galicia, such as Exile here from 1904, now missing, suggest his profound sympathy for downtrodden Jews during an era of pogroms in partitioned Poland and the nearby Pale of Settlement. The picture Exile shows its title in correct Hebrew, galut, meaning diaspora or dispersion. The next year, in the Jewish Museum in New York, his black banner shows the broad brushwork and dark pigments that echo Rembrandt's own late works. Moreover, these aged, bearded Jewish faces surely stem from those rabbis close to Rembrandt, especially the signed and dated 1654 painting in the Hermitage on the right, often called Old Jew in an armchair. The grim subject of Hirschenberg's painting here, however, was the Hasidic burial of a pogrom victim, which accounts for its dark colors and facial expressions. Of course, the same dark costumes and beards are hallmarks of Eastern European observant Jewish men. And Hirschenberg had established an early reputation with genre subjects of Jews, such as this Mourners in a Jewish Cemetery from the Jewish Museum in Paris. Perhaps the 19th century's greatest Rembrandt acolyte was the Dutch Jewish painter Joseph Israels. Trained at the Amsterdam Royal Academy and École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, he adopted the current French fascination with humble peasant figures, but he also turned to his native Dutch heritage to emphasize poor fishermen and farmers. Israel's dark-toned, boldly brushed works were inspired by both Rembrandt and Dutch peasant paintings. In large-scale images, Israel's often featured scenes of human suffering or even death. This signature work in the Jewish Museum has an expressly Jewish subject, and its title is A Son of the Ancient Race. It depicts a downtrodden peddler of secondhand objects, which sit forlornly next to him on his stoop. Large, expressive hands and a shadowed, craggy face draw on late Rembrandt works. In fact, Israel's became known as a second Rembrandt. In the works of the French critic Edmond Duranty, and I quote, "A man with his heart in the right place, a moved and moving artist, Israel's adds to the genius of the Dutch school, something that among the old masters is to be found only in the great spirit of Rembrandt." The 1895 print at the left on the occasion of Israel's 70th birthday by Dutch artist Johan Brakensiek shows Rembrandt himself bestowing a laurel wreath on the head of an aged Israels who stands with palette in hand before an easel. Rembrandt is declaring, and I quote from the bottom, "In the name of Dutch painting, I pay you tribute." Late Israel's self-portraits, such as the one on the right, offer frank depiction of his aged features and white beard, and clearly draw upon Rembrandt's own lifetime of varied self-portraits. This one is in the Toledo Museum of Art. It shows the artist well-dressed with a bowler hat and a prominent gold watch, a watch fob akin to Rembrandt's own tactile representation of such chains in a number of pictures, such as this one in Cologne, the late self-portrait that Gary just showed us. And of course, in many of Rembrandt's self-portraits, this is an imaginary conferred status of royal reward. We see it also, for example, in the Aristotle in New York. And here in the right, Israel's also depicted a canvas behind him of Saul and David, which refers to two Rembrandt works of the same subject, as well as to a road not taken toward history painting by this native Dutch painter of genre subjects. Israels was a very successful painter with numerous exhibitions in the Paris Salon and even in the 1878 World's Fair in Paris. He was buried after a state funeral in the Scheveningen Jewish cemetery near The Hague. But here again, we can rely on the words of our artists as well. Israels wrote his own verbal appreciation of Rembrandt, particularly for those paintings that he knew firsthand from Amsterdam. His book concludes with his own modern Dutch thoughts about his painter model, a summation of 19th century views of what he calls this unequaled genius to whom Holland proudly points as one of her own sons. And I quote again, "Never was Rembrandt's art valued so highly as it is now. During his lifetime, there were people who condemned Rembrandt because he refused to follow in the footsteps of the old Italian painters, because he persisted in painting nature as he saw it. It was fortunate indeed that Rembrandt always felt strong in his own convictions and only followed his own views. The more liberal feelings of the modern world have achieved some victories in the realm of art. May these pages convey to the reader the fact that I have always looked upon Rembrandt as the true type of an artist. Free, untrammeled by traditions, genial in all he did. In short, a figure in whom all the great qualities of the old Republic of the United Provinces were concentrated and reflected," end quote. German painter Max Liebermann was a lifelong friend of Joseph Israels, and he enjoyed the greatest prominence and success of any Jewish painter during his long Berlin-based career. Liebermann became president of the Prussian Academy of Arts in 1920 and received an honorary doctorate from the University of Berlin in 1912, as well as major retrospective exhibitions on several occasions. However, he also lived long enough to suffer for his background in his later years under the Nazis. And even his early work was criticized for being non-German. Jewish biblical subjects are rare in Liebermann's work, largely because he generated an early firestorm of criticism when he painted this picture: Jesus among the rabbis in the temple, now in Hamburg. Here, the precocious 12-year-old Jesus is already debating biblical passages before astonished Jewish elders, clad in characteristically dark Ashkenazi dress with fur hats and talitot. Initially, Liebermann gave the boy Jewish features and omitted any halo. However, after his work was removed from its Munich exhibition and called blasphemous by Christian critics, the artist relented and altered the features of young Jesus. But afterwards, he almost exclusively avoided religious subjects. In contrast to an increasingly nationalistic official taste in German museums, Liebermann became an independent leader of the Berlin secession art resistance, selected as its first president. He arranged for Israels to show in Berlin and made him an honorary member of the group, which was branded by one hostile critic, poet Ernst Schnur, as, quote, an art movement of specifically Jewish character. While his direct reliance on Rembrandt through imitation is less overt than that of Israel's, Lieberman, like Rembrandt, produced self-portraits across his career, usually with brush in hand, but always dressed fashionably. More subtly, Lieberman occasionally responded in his own drawings and prints, especially of his daughter and grandchild, to Rembrandt's drawn figure studies, especially of women and children, a few of which he actually owned. But he is quoted as saying, and I quote, "Whenever I see a Frans Hals, I feel like painting. But when I see a Rembrandt, I feel like giving up." In effect, Rembrandt served less as a literal visual model for Lieberman's art making and more as a prototype for modern art, for an imagery with a universal human dimension conveyed without sentimentality. And as we just heard from Gary Schwartz, Berlin under Wilhelm Bode was ground zero for Rembrandt research at the turn of the 20th century. And not only did Lieberman own most of the important publications about Rembrandt, but he also knew the scholars themselves, starting with Wilhelm Bode at the Kaiser Friedrich Museum. And he painted Bode's portrait and was close to many of the members that we just heard about from the Museum Verein. Despite the late 19th century decline of art academies as tastemakers, Rembrandt was still celebrated anew, precisely for that personal independence from convention and fidelity to nature. However, for other Jewish artists, especially in picturesque figure studies or biblical histories, Rembrandt could still loom large as an inspiration. A famous artist, Jewish to the core, Marc Chagall, writes in his first autobiography of 1925 that he dedicated the work to, and I quote, "Rembrandt, Cézanne, my mother, and my wife," unquote. He still invokes the same litany later in the same work. "I think with more joy about my family, Rembrandt, Leonardo, Manet, Cézanne, Picasso, and my wife." Just as art history infuses and defines his own family history, Chagall conceives of his Dutch artistic predecessor through the metaphor of family, a concept still bearing the indelible imprint of the artist's identity as an émigré Russian Jew living in Paris. The only peers whom Chagall's ego permitted him to embrace fully are the old masters. Suffering pangs of homesickness when he first moved to Paris, it was the Louvre, he writes, that welcomed him with open arms and convinced him to stay. About his origins, fusing both the temperament and Jewishness that he associates with the Dutch painter Rembrandt, Chagall asserts, and I quote, "Only Rembrandt knows what my old grandfather, butcher, shopkeeper, and cantor, was thinking while his son played to the window." But his most assertive cri de coeur toward the Dutch painter was a sudden outburst near the end of his later autobiography called My Life in 1947 that, and I quote, "I'm certain that Rembrandt loves me," end quote. Whereas he felt that Russia had rejected him as both artist and Jew, and something that may be slightly redressed in this exhibition, in Chagall's imagination, Rembrandt accepted him unconditionally on both counts. Although best known for his evocation of his own youth in an imagined shtetl environment, the latter half of Chagall's very long career was almost entirely devoted to biblical imagery, and it included a Jewish Jesus on the cross and a number of crucifixion scenes, both before and during World War II. But some of Chagall's sentiments, as both Jew and artist, he folded into a speech before the Jewish Writers' Committee in 1947, referring to several artists, but touching particularly on his sentiments about Rembrandt and the Bible, and I quote, "Rembrandt, unrecognized, without power, closed himself in his biblical vision, but humanity was truly touched by the creators who touched its soul. Rembrandt's texture, the rays of light. An artist is one who provides an expression of the soul, independent of subject matter." And a decade later, in a lecture at the University of Chicago, Chagall makes explicit what the Bible meant to him during this period. "In the course of these last 10 years, I've worked a great deal. Joy came to me in the form of illustrated books being published, and among them, the Bible," end quote. And here are his Bible prints that I'll be showing you, where Chagall comes closest to emulating the prior example that he found in Rembrandt. In 1930, Parisian dealer Ambroise Vollard commissioned from Chagall illustrations for the Hebrew Bible, a new turn for the artist toward biblical subjects. After Vollard's death, the project was assumed by the publishing house Teriad, but progress was slow. 66 plates were made between 1932 and 1939, but the rest were completed only between 1952 and 1956, after the artist returned from his wartime exile in America. Thus, the project began to assume a role in asserting the artist's own Jewish identity and the survival of his people in the wake of the Holocaust. He featured later images in the series with wartime heroic heroes and leaders, Joshua, Samson, David, Solomon, as well as prophets. Meyer Shapiro eloquently characterizes the prophets for what he calls their integrity and solitude, their vision of God, and prophecies of the misfortunes and consolations of Israel. Chagall's choices not only record his sentiments as a Jewish artist in the present, but also connect his own biblical imagery with art historical tradition, particularly Rembrandt. Shapiro notes, it's clear that Chagall has read the text for himself, but his sacrifice of Manoah, at the left here, is reminiscent of Rembrandt's painting in the Louvre of the angel leaving Tobias. And his David playing before Saul, at the left, seems to be an image of Rembrandt's great painting of this scene, end quote. Like Rembrandt's Bible, Chagall's is a human Bible, reduced to a few large-scale figures with vivid gestures, akin to Rembrandt's Moses in Berlin or Jacob wrestling the angel. Both works quite familiar to Chagall from the Berlin Museum. Chagall avoids the miracles and spectacle of 19th century biblical images by Doré, for example, although his earlier paintings of Vitebsk had already emphasized the visionary. Like Rembrandt, Chagall also emphasizes the presence of winged angels as figures of light, drawing upon his own previous renderings of Russian flying figures. Angels serve as mediators to the Godhead, which in good Jewish tradition Chagall does not represent. Following Rembrandt's etching, Chagall, in his prints, especially of the Bible, asserts the hand of the artist, achieved through the etching process, and his own distinctive imagery. He particularly emphasizes graphic effects of dramatic light and dark, presumably with a shared theological point about light as the symbol of the divine. Oops, skipped one, sorry. Chaim Soutine, who was eloquently introduced to us the first week by Simon Schama, was born near Minsk in Belarus. And he also made his career in Paris in the circle of Jacques Lipchitz and Amedeo Modigliani. From visits to the Louvre, he became obsessed with Rembrandt, particularly this painting on the right of the flayed ox from 1655. According to Chana Orloff, a contemporary Jewish sculptor in Paris, she claimed, and I quote, "I can still see him gazing at the canvases of Rembrandt with respectful awe. He would contemplate them for a long time, go into a trance, then suddenly stamp his foot and explain, 'This is so beautiful, it drives me mad.'" Soutine said to the dealer, René Gimpel, that for him, Rembrandt is the idol, excelling all painters. Velázquez is nothing beside him. And he praised the Jewish Bride in particular as probably the most beautiful canvas in existence, with its penetrating study of clothing and the hands, which are so beautiful. And around 1925, Soutine began to paint in earnest, one of several versions of the flayed ox, with an even greater love of impasto brushwork, now heightened in blood red color, harmonies against this blue backdrop. This was Soutine's only direct evocation of a Rembrandt model, but it remains a heartfelt testament to his enduring admiration of his Dutch hero during his own artistic formation. Now we turn to America. Russian-born, the immigrant American painter Raphael Soyer made sketches of masterworks, including The Jewish Bride, which you see on the left and his drawing on the right, during his extensive travels in Europe, and he dedicated a substantial portion of his journal opinions to works by artists, including Rembrandt. Sawyer often wrote about Rembrandt with unalloyed admiration, including a full chapter on Rembrandt in his book, Homage to Thomas Eakins, etc. Sawyer wrote, among other things, "I've seen many paintings these months, yet here I was in the Rembrandt room, gaping as though I had never seen a painting before." In 1959, Sawyer even painted a lost self-portrait where he pictured himself in the company of three of his favorite artists, including Rembrandt, Corot, and Degas. That fascinating work demonstrated, in literal terms, the company that Sawyer strove to keep. In the case of Rembrandt, it's often based on the forthright frontal early self-portraits. Toward the end of his life, Sawyer wrote, "Usually I draw and paint myself when I'm alone, moody and unshaven, and I recall mentally the self-portraits by favorite masters. Rembrandt is St. Paul." End quote. About the hands in The Prodigal Son and The Jewish Bride, Sawyer waxes eloquent. "These hands symbolize for me the phenomenon of the old Rembrandt, his feeling for people, his acceptance of life and awareness and acceptance of death. How deep the sympathy in his portraits of people." End quote. Like his idol, Sawyer was a most prolific self-portraitist with over 40 examples known. This early self-representation is in some ways modeled after the Rembrandt frontal print that you see on the right. And Sawyer states, "I thought of Rembrandt's early etchings of himself, but I didn't consider my earliest etching successful." Here's another frontal self-portrait from age 81 at the left from the year 1980 in the Thyssen collection in Madrid. So like both Rembrandt and Max Liebermann, Sawyer shows himself at work with a large easel on the right edge and a huge palette in his hand. By the latter half of the 20th century, artists in the pop art movement, exemplified by Andy Warhol, often made refashioned replicas of everyday objects or public celebrities. Larry Rivers, who was born Yitzroch Loisa Grossberg, sometimes, by contrast, referenced much more famous artworks, which he refashioned. For Rivers, Rembrandt remained a particular favorite to copy and to adapt, and he most frequently used this painting from Amsterdam, the Syndics of the Drapers Guild. It had already become commodified as the advertising image in America for Dutch Masters cigars. Rivers replicated that image many times, and he started with a painting of 1963, but then he moved in the work on the left from 1964 to 8 into a lithograph, replicating in his own distinctive outline drawing style, not only the Rembrandt icon, but also the cigars in their commercial box, thus revealing how the artwork itself was already being turned into a tool of commerce. Rivers would produce numerous different variations on this basic Rembrandt theme. Along with screen prints, he also featured mixed media versions like the one on the right from 1968, which even simulated the cardboard box in cigars, always signed and dated, as you can see. And he included the same Dutch masters in a 1991 late career retrospective of compiled images, which he titled Greatest Hits, like the long play music anthologies made by popular recording artists. At the risk of just a little extra time, I want to speak briefly about a major Jewish painter from both England and America who was left out of Sir Simon Schama's lively presentation. And here I offer special thanks to Mirjam for endorsing the artist and sharing research materials, as well as to Gary Schwartz for his thoughtful Schwartz list number 360 devoted to R.B. Kitaj. Very few 20th century painters have embraced both aspects of Rembrandt, a commitment to the Hebrew Bible and an intense personal self-reference. R.B. Kitaj was the expatriate son of a Viennese immigrant, born in America, but who worked first in London and then in Los Angeles. A self-proclaimed Jewish artist, Kitaj asserted himself through his publication of 2 diasporous manifestos, commenting on his own professed midrash in paint. His allegiance to Rembrandt is emphatic, but it also appears within a wide-ranging influence from other old master artists, as well as modernists. For example, in his second diasporous manifesto of 2007, published the year that he died, Kitaj asserts, There are, of course, many non-Jewish prophets of my new religion. These are my diaspora host prophets, from Giotto to Rembrandt, to Nietzsche, to Cézanne, to Degas, to Matisse, to my best man under the chuppah, Hockney. Kitai even ranks his artistic influences. Cézanne is my Siddur, or prayer book, my favorite painter. No Jew is among my top 12, alas. But as of April 2004, in no great order, he then lists Rembrandt as number 8. Or he claims, may I welcome particularly into my variant Jewish art tradition, much, much Rembrandt, as good as any artist ever. Kitai paid homage to Rembrandt in several variations on familiar works by the master. The most familiar and striking is his characteristically color-rich Jewish Rider of 1984-85, part of what the artist called his Passion series. This work clearly stems from Rembrandt's Polish Rider in New York's Frick collection. But Kitai shifts the figure to a train, presumably leading to a concentration camp, whose ominous smoking chimney on the horizon sits beneath a cross on a hill. Kitai imposes the face of art historian Michael Podro while retaining only the original sad-saddle pose and the suggestion of a horse beneath this rider. Atop a blood-red receding corridor at the right is the dark silhouette of a conductor brandishing a coercive whip. A more positive image, excerpted directly from a small 1646 Rembrandt panel of Abraham and the Three Angels, recently sold at auction, is the glowing central angel. Kitai again retains his extended posture, but transforms him into a large red seraph who causes a bearded profile Abraham in lower right to gape in wonder as Sarah looks on from the open doorway. And indeed, the figure of Abraham is very similar to the white-bearded older face of Kitai himself. Kitai also made a number of lithographic religious portraits, as he called them, of Jewish biblical figures, such as Abraham and Isaac, but also Sarah laughing, Rebecca, Rachel, Ruth. After moving to Los Angeles in 1997, he paid posthumous homage to his late wife, Sarah Fisher, who died in 2002. In works such as this variation on Rembrandt's own tender late work, The Jewish Bride, he altered the faces and pictured the bride, or Sandra, in the form of an angel. This is called Nose Kiss, 2003. And Kitai adapts a younger self-portrait mixed with that of the strange old Hasidic Rabbi Schneerson together as he fondles the angel or Sandra's breast. I'll end with his words from his posthumously published Confessions of 2017, which conveys his love of Rembrandt and his profound personal Jewish identity, as well as a personalized vision of a universal theme. As you know, Sandra is in our studio with me. I'm painting us every day at Los Angeles. This painting was inspired by an etching by the Judeophile Rembrandt, blessed be he, of two old Jews schmoozing in their synagogue. The two Jews are now Sandra and me in Los Angeles. The Kitai angel, after Rembrandt's old Jew, is exaggerated in girth with a head of quite wide geography. My shoulder insignia is that of a self-awarded Jewish general. The pentimenti of Sandra's left hand indicate that she's trying to cover her sex as part of our foreplay while she kisses me on my nose. This painting is the latest episode of my greatest story ever told, the woman-man story. And I'd like to end, perhaps fittingly, with yet another late 20th century post-war Jewish American artist, Leonard Baskin, who could still declare that he knew of no truly Jewish artist from history except for Käthe Kollwitz and Rembrandt. Thank you very much.
Larry, that was lovely. What a wonderful succession of images and stories. I suppose it's up to us to find out whether non-Jewish artists in that period could produce work of that kind, but I'm convinced that if you look at the percentages, to the Jews are going to be the greatest admirers of Rembrandt. I was very upset to see in the chat that my sound wasn't very good in my own talk. I went out of my way to buy this major microphone that overrules my webcam microphone, but I wasn't using it right, I don't think. I should have paid more attention to the way that Tina Turner uses a microphone, just sticking it into your mouth. That's what I should have been doing. I hope I'm better. I can be heard better now. Our last speaker today, Laurence Sigal, is the founding director of one of the great European museums of art, of Jewish art and history, the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire du Judaïsme in Paris. Impressively, she served in that capacity for nearly a quarter of a century, from 1888 until 2011. In that way, she put an indelible mark on the museology of Judaism in France and beyond. During that time, she also edited a groundbreaking volume with Paul Salmona on the archaeology of Jewish sites in France and Europe. She was longtime director of the Fondation du Judaïsme Français, the foremost institution for Jewish culture in France. Laurence has kindly agreed to talk about the presentation of Rembrandt in Jewish museums. As the curator of the largest exhibition ever mounted on Rembrandt and Judaism, for which a magnificent catalog was published, she is uniquely qualified to talk on the subject. Laurence.
Thank you so much, Gary. Well, actually, listening to you, I realized how the Rembrandt's project was really my moment. It lasted for more than 2 years, and it was huge work, but this was my favorite project. So I would like to start with thanking you and Mirjam and Leah Chechik for inviting me to take part into the seminar. And I must say I'm not only honored, but also very impressed to speak in front of such a distinguished Areopagus of prominent authors, Shelley, Perlove, Simon Schama, yourself, Gary, and Larry Silver, by alphabetical order. And it's a wonderful opportunity to say again that the exhibition showed in Paris at the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire du Judaïsme could not have existed without the almost simultaneous publications of Michael Zell's Reframing Rembrandt, Jews and the Christian Image in the 17th Century, Amsterdam, in 2002, and Stephen Nadler's Rembrandt's Jews in 2003. Michael and Stephen, you've been our guides. In the run-up of the 400th anniversary of Rembrandt's birth, the Joodse Historisch Museum in Amsterdam and the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire du Judaïsme have simultaneously projected to devote an exhibition to the master. And it has been really a pleasure to collaborate with Mirjam and Edward van Volen without competing. And it was such an easy cooperation. Both exhibitions acknowledge the reappraisal of an ironic vision of the Jewish society in Amsterdam and a very exaggerated love story between Rembrandt and the Jews and vice versa. However, each exhibition followed a particular prism. I will try to show some slides. Évidemment, ça marche pas. 1 second. Yeah. So the Jewish Rembrandt in Amsterdam. Although there was a great deal of overlap between the two exhibitions, they had very different approaches. In Amsterdam, Mirjam Knotter and Edward van Volen undertook, with the encouragement of several colleagues who were not the least in the field, such as Bob van den Bogert and Dudok van Heel, to examine the commonly held view of Rembrandt's sympathy for the Jews. At the turn of our century, this position had been highly moderated already from the prevailing 19th century view, and almost all rabbis and all Jews had been removed to their rightful place as figures or tronies. The curators of the exhibition were convinced that only a Jewish museum could undertake such a re-examination without being suspected of malicious or even anti-Semitic intentions. Mirjam Notter will certainly tell us more of her conversation. In a rather audacious way, the Jewish Museum in Amsterdam proposed a revised history of the Judaization of Rembrandt through a kind of case study on which this construction of a Jewish Rembrandt was based. The title of the exhibition was quite provocative: The Jewish Rembrandt, the Myth Unraveled. You have it, the cover of the catalog was Moses. The Jewish Historical Museum set about a step-by-step investigation into the relationship between Rembrandt and what is summarily referred to as his Jewish environment. Was it reality, exaggeration, or even legend? The short multimedia and the map that opened the exhibition perfectly illustrated this fact-checking approach, a kind of Jewish Rembrandt research project. Re-examining the legend of an overly Judaized Rembrandt required a precise topographical framework, and 2 weeks ago, Mirjam has drawn again an even more fascinating portrait of the Jewish quarter by a precise use of archives and topography. This map set the tone for the museum's method. The exhibition was constructed following a series of questions, reviewing all the claims which had been developed about Rembrandt and Jewish figures from the end of the 17th century to Rembrandt's The Jews and the Bible, the work published in 1946 by Franz Landsberger. So you had several parts: a Jewish neighborhood, then Rembrandt's conflict with his Jewish neighbors, his relationship with Menashe ben Israel, with Ephraim Bueno, Spinoza, and other rabbis, his Jewish models for the Christ image, portraits of all Jews and rabbis, and it also included a section dealing with the master's influence upon Jewish artists during the 19th century and after. The exhibition discussed 3 major paintings: Moses and the Table of the Covenant, Belshazzar, and the Sublime Jewish Bride, or Isaac and Rebecca. In Paris, the approach was different. With my co-curator, Alexis Merle-Dubourg, we wanted to examine the biblical and the Jewish elements in Rembrandt's works as symptoms of the encounter of old and new religions and of the widening of the universe, both geographical and mental, in which it developed, while using this context to better apprehend the modernity of the resurrected Judaism in Amsterdam during the Golden Age. The exhibition wanted to show the centrality of the religious and patriotic effervescence in the Netherlands in the painting of Rembrandt and his contemporaries, and how he, in a movement that was unique to this degree, had somehow condensed it. The exhibition was untitled, Rembrandt and the New Jerusalem, Jews and Christian in Golden Age Amsterdam. In contrast to the Joods Historisch Museum, whose permanent display deals with the history of Jews in Amsterdam and the Netherlands, Paris could not do without telling the very singular story of the new Christians becoming new Jews, the reinvention of Judaism in Amsterdam, as Joseph Kaplan so aptly puts it. Thus, the exhibition was divided into 4 distinct parts: being Jewish in Amsterdam in Rembrandt's time, the Jews as seen by Rembrandt in the Gospels, portrait and expressive figures, Rembrandt and his contemporaries as interpreters of the Old Testament, and finally, Rembrandt and the Messiah figures. The closest and maybe only predecessor of these 2 projects was the Jews in the Age of Rembrandt, an exhibition curated in 1981 by Susan Morgenstein and Ruth Levine for the Judaic Museum of the Jewish Community Center of Greater Washington. And this exhibition subsequently toured to other non-Jewish institutions. It was a precursor, though far less ambitious than its 2 followers. It was limited to engravings by Rembrandt, purporting to depict Jews or Jewish types. It included also some engravings illustrating Old Testament scenes by the master's contemporaries. This catalog included a seminal paper by Simon Schama, opening with the following words: Michelangelo's Moses has horns. Rembrandt's does not. With this minor act of iconographical surgery, the image of the Jew was translated from the realm of monsters to the realm of men. In Dutch art, unlike any other Christian art before, the Jew was readmitted to the company of humanity. And Schama concludes, Jews loved Rembrandt because the master depicted them as they wished to be represented. 40 years later, Gary and Mirjam and Leah still refer to this striking overture. Maybe this article was the first piece in a catalog about Rembrandt to revisit the so-called empathy of Rembrandt towards Amsterdam Jews. He carefully examines their supposed polyglot humanism and reviews the economic facts and figures which led us to reconsider the true role of Jews in the bustling commercial development of Amsterdam. This was the cover of the catalog. Whether idealized or not, Schama quotes the words of praise in 1616 by Rabbi Yitzchak Uziel, the Moroccan rabbi who was called to the rabbinate in Amsterdam in 1610. The rabbi, I quote, "At present, people live peaceably in Amsterdam. The inhabitants of the city, mindful of the increase of population, make laws and ordinances whereby the freedom of religions may be upheld. Each may follow his own belief, but may not openly show that he is a different faith from the inhabitants of the city." However, there is a wide gap between the balanced analysis by Simon Schama, which focused mostly on Amsterdam economy and society, and the critical approach which almost undoes Jewish documented and certified presence in Rembrandt's work, except less than a handful of paintings. One more significant detail. the Washington catalog showed the Jews in the synagogue on its cover as if the whole family of supposedly Jewish types were gathered there. And the opening illustration was a so-called Menashe ben Israel portrait. 40 years ago, we were still far from the reappraisal of Rembrandt's affinity with the Jews. I would like now to go back to some ideas which were underlying the Paris exhibition. First of all, a new passion for images and self-representation shared by Jews and Christians. A novelty for both the Jewish and the Protestant world, which abhors images, is the appearance of numerous portraits of rabbis and theologians. In 1621, the first map of the Holy Land in Hebrew included a self-portrait of its author, Jacob Justo, Yaakov ben Avraham Tzadik. And the author justifies himself saying that it is such a great innovation that I had decided to include my portrait. A section in the Paris catalog presented portraits commissioned by rabbis, Leo Templo, Nashe, Isaac Aboab, Jacob Sasportas, and doctors who were also very learned Jews, Joseph del Medigo, Abraham Zacuto, this is the young, Ephraim Bueno, who were all men of great learning. The second point was also the reinvention of Judaism and pre-modernity. The forced conversion of the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula had naturally created a deep hostility towards Catholicism and possibly affinities with Amsterdam Christians. Amsterdam may not have been the haven that some paradise that some authors ever described, like Panofsky, for instance. But Portuguese Jews had truly escaped from hell and from its flames. So we tried to put the supposed convivencia between Jews and Christians in Amsterdam into perspective. The third point was which was just going through the whole exhibition, was reading and reinterpreting the Bible. Looking back at the catalog, this is the series of rabbinical portraits. Looking back at the catalog, one of the key points in the Paris exhibition was the examination of the principle of identification in all senses, the identification of the Portuguese Jews with the Hebrews and the Judean exiles in Babylon, of the Dutch with the figures of the Old and New Testament, and on a very different level, of the old men with the Jews by art historians of previous century in Rembrandt's work. If we had a demonstration to make, it was to show how these different readings were constructed. This desire to interpret the Rembrandt's painting as sophisticated hermeneutic images may have led to an exaggeration of his status as doctus pictor, and to the belief that he either read more than any theologian and followed the editorial activity, or that he had countless conversations with theologians of different religions and denominations who taught him how to read the Bible. And Shelley Perlove, in her lecture last week, has showed us again when analyzing the presentation to the temple, how this conviction can operate. An important theme as well was millenarianism and messianism. We wanted to approach Rembrandt's work through the prevailing millenarianism and to study certain works in the light of the impact of this messianic atmosphere on the various religious communities in Amsterdam. Inspired here by Shelley Perlove's illuminating articles, we have tried to identify the figure of salvation from the Old Testament, and in particular Daniel, Esther, and Mordechai, the heroes of the Portuguese Jews. If these figures also proceed from an identification process, they contain more than that. So here you can see a section dedicated to Shabtai Tzvi and his followers, the triumph of Mordechai, and then the highlight of the exhibition, which was the disgrace of Haman from St. Petersburg. Now let's go back to Judaization. To build its core demonstration, Amsterdam put a special effort on gathering works which had been falsely referred to as Jewish portraits. A spectacular series of more than a dozen paintings was displayed. It was a climax of the exhibition. Interestingly, all of them were not works by Rembrandt himself, but by his circle or atelier, some being by other artists. These paintings were chosen from catalogs which, since the 18th century onwards, mentioned dozens of portraits of rabbis and all Jews. Edmé Gersin, John Smith, and Charles Leblanc principally. The Paris exhibition too devoted a section to the Judaization of Rembrandt since the 17th century, mostly based on the literature about engraving. It included two portraits of young Jews by Rembrandt and one painting by Rembrandt Atelier, which is one of the many that have been wrongly entitled Old Man with a Red Hat from Berlin. But it was not the central topic of our exhibition. In the foreword to the catalogue, my co-author, Alexis Merle-Dubourg, and I referred to what is called Rembrandt's empathy in a very cautious way and stressed the psychological dimension as a driving force. Quote, since the 19th century, the actors of Jewish art, artists, historians, collectors, and museums have shown a particular predilection for Rembrandt's work because of an empathy with the Jews, which was assumed in the master. It seems to be a foregone conclusion that Rembrandt had lived among Jews, had loved them, and that their presence permeated his work. This perception was fueled by a surge of gratitude from those who remembered many pejorative representations of the Jewish people in Western art, and who wanted to see in the genius painting the reflection of a benevolent humanism on the part of a Christian artist. And here I would like to mention the strong impact of Panofsky's lecture, Rembrandt und das Judentum, that he gave in January 1921 at the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums. He writes, and this is my condensed translation, I apologize, Rembrandt seems to be the precursor of the Judaizing trend in visual art. The taste for a religious, realistic, and historically concrete painting led Rembrandt to observe the Jews at the beginning of his career. In 1636, he met Menashe ben Israel, with whom he became a close friend. Panofsky then presents his reading of the evolution of the painter's work through three stages, from a strong characterization by features, gesture, and pictures, to a second one, psychological and dramatic portraits, and finally, he attains to metaphysical painting. He evokes a movement that transcends the individual to the idea of man itself. And he uses the supposed portrait of Jews, overdetermined by details, to show that in his late work, the genius reaches a point where he depicts the very essence of the human being, sub specie aeternitatis. Panofsky, this great mind, embodies this strong desire. It's a dream to see Jewish figures in Rembrandt's work. As an epitome of his thinking, he uses the disgrace of Haman, we've seen just earlier, explaining that all narrative aspects have faded, as well as psychological and dramatic elements. He writes, there is no longer a villain, nor an angry character, nor a triumphant one. To conclude, I would like to go back to Rembrandt and Menashe ben Israel, because I heard from the former presentation that we're still questioning their relationship. They are indeed our two heroes. And it's very frustrating not to be able to arbitrate. I would like to feed this discussion with a few remarks. First, when it is said that the only proven portrait, the only proven portrait of Menashe ben Israel is the one by Shalom Italia that you can see here, and that by comparison, Rembrandt's portraits cannot be the one of Menashe, is this a valid argument? Without criticizing Shalom Italia's talent, the relatively naive portrait he produced of Menashe, like the one he produced, by the way, of Leon Templo, does not allow us to raise it to the standard of realism, even considering the fact that Menashe had sent it as an approval to Abraham von Frankenburg. Second, I would like again to stress the coincidence of dates between the portrait of Menashe and the publication of the De Creatione Problemata. This first philosophical work in Latin, it was the first one in Latin, published by Menashe ben Israel in 1635, dealing with the question of creation ex nihilo, was naturally intended for Christians, as evidenced by Menashe's dedicatory epistle to David de Willem. But the book included also an epigramma in Problemata Clarissimi Viri Menassis ben Israel, De Creatione, by Caspar Barlheus, whom Chama calls an immensely influential writer and orator. And as early as 1985, Gary Schwartz suggests in his Rembrandt, His Life and Paintings, that Caspar Barlheus was Rembrandt's advisor on religious matter. Can this fact reinforce the opinion that it is highly plausible that the 1636 portrait is Menashe's? Stephen Nadler has just, third point, has just published an exhaustive article with Victor Tiribas on these difficult issues. Rembrandt's etching for Menashe ben Israel, Piedra Gloriosa, a mystery solved. It was just published last month. The authors quote a document dated May 6, 1655, in which the Mahamad, which is the board, the official board of the community, formally forbids Menashe to publish his book with a fourth image. That is the beast. I'm sorry. I missed a very important. I wanted to show the 4 illustrations for Piedra Gloriosa. with the force. So the Muhammad forbids him to publish the book with the force image, that is, the image of the beasts and God, the Chayot HaKodesh, and God in majesty. But as the authors conclude, this wonderful source does not really solve the problem of the anteriority of the Rembrandt series or the one of the Shalom Italia series. However, I'd like to note that the copies of the uncut sheets in the Dutuit collection in the Petit Palais, in the Edmond of Rothschild collection in the Louvre, in the British Museum, and in the House of Rembrandt, the Lord who's there, the Atik Yomin, is still very visible. Oh, by the way, I just thought that the Son of Ancient Days by Joseph Israel, it's a very weird expression. And Atik Yomin, it's the Hebrew biblical word in Daniel, and it refers to God. So there is a double allusion to Rembrandt. So the representation is still very visible when sheets are uncut. And I would like to add two further material considerations or questions. Was the number of prints insufficient compared to the copies of the books? Did Menashe take copies of his Piedra when he sailed to London? Did he need more copies? I would like also to remind that these engravings were a remarkable move on the part of Rembrandt, who did not seem to be keen on producing engraved illustration for books. Apart from the Piedra Gloriosa, he made a total of 3 engravings for books, including the one for Medea or the marriage of Jason and Creusa for his eminent and dear friend Jan Six in 1648. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurence, for this very rich presentation. And I'd like to respond, first in short about Menashe ben Israel, about the portrait. I just counted while you were talking Rembrandt's etched portraits of people who wrote. There are 14 of them. All of them have books in the hand or on the desk. That Rembrandt would have made a portrait of a bookman like Menashe ben Israel, a writer, a publisher, a printer, the man of the book. Without a book, I think it requires a lot more argumentation than you brought. Now, I want to thank you a lot for posing emphatically and correctly the key issue in all discussion of Rembrandt and Judaism, the difference between the way the Jewish Museum in Amsterdam and Jewish Museum in Paris dealt with the underlying values. You feel that the Amsterdam Museum took too dim a view of Jewish-Christian relations in Rembrandt's time. And I'm going to take advantage of this moment to tell you why I think that your view of Jewish Amsterdam is too rose-colored.
Yeah.
Now, in 1620, the Dutch poet Joost van de Vondel published a picture album of God's heroes in the Old Covenant. It has 38 engravings of patriarchs, prophets, and heroes of the Old Testament, from Adam and Eve to Judah Maccabee, with accompanying captions and page-long texts, not verses. This is the kind of product that makes the heart beat faster of those in search of Christian sympathy for the Jews among them. In the same year, Vondel brought out his second stage play, Jerusalem Destroyed. The text of the play is preceded by a sonnet addressed to Vondel's own contemporary Jews, who in these years were being admitted under strictly defined conditions of tolerance into the city, as an exception because they weren't being admitted many places in the Netherlands. Let me read this poem to you. To the Jewish rabbis, a sonnet. Your company of priests could not contain its glee when Jesus' arms were stretched and hammered to the block, crucified, abused, despised, and bemocked, because he had to drink that beaker to the lees. Little did they know that justice from on high would even out the scales in heaven's gilt abode, would value guiltless blood above Ophiric gold, and grant the weight of truth to each last scorned sigh. But then the day arrived that God had foreordained for vengeance on that place of godlessness unreigned, so smugly sure of safety on holy temples airy. The people realized what punishment they earned, which their evilness could not avert or turn, nor fortified defense or specious sanctuary. In other words, the Jews had it coming to them, that Jerusalem was destroyed, and their hypocritical reverence for God on the Temple Mount could not help them. This is not unique. It is absolutely typical, even mandatory, for pious Christians. Any and all reference to the Old Testament in Christian poetry and iconography of Rembrandt's time is not a bridge to contemporary Judaism, but exactly the opposite. The Christians identified with the biblical Jews and were out to replace the Jews of their own time. Look only at the first caption to God's heroes of the Old Covenant, with its quotation not from Genesis but from Corinthians, attesting to the resurrection of those who believe in Christ and the death of all others. Laurence, in your catalog, Rembrandt et la Nouvelle Jérusalem, you wrote, New Jerusalem for the Protestants, the city built on the shores of the Ai, is also for the Jews. I'm afraid to have to disagree with you. The lives of Jews were safe in Amsterdam, and that is a lot to be thankful for. Individual Jews gained esteem from a handful of Dutch Christians, which is great. But the New Jerusalem of a Christian like Vondel, and he uses the phrase, was built expressly to keep the Jews of the Old Jerusalem firmly out. In the exhibition Mirjam and I have now made with the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow, we deliberately avoided the polemic in which we engaged in 2006. In the new exhibition, we let all the historical personalities and institutions we quote speak for themselves without contradiction or correction. That goes also for your own outstanding exhibition of 2006, but I did feel called upon to respond to your talk in this way also as a start for our roundtable discussion. You may be the first to respond to my response.
Well, I'm afraid that I've been misunderstood because, of course, it was the New Jerusalem was for the Christians. But I also wanted, after a discussion, a short discussion, brief discussion we had with Mirjam, she also tried to say, well, Amsterdam was not that wonderful and there was anti-Semitic. Okay. But our catalog was based on, the last publication, the latest publications, and I think we were quite realistic. And in this talk, I must say, I can see I am still a victim of the desire to envisage Amsterdam and Rembrandt as a kind of better world. Yeah, so I confess that. But we did not work in that direction. the exhibition itself was very documented and not too optimistic, though I might sound today optimistic.
Well, we'll present both of the exhibitions in our exhibition without parti pris, and we look forward to other reactions. Please, members of the panel, unmute yourselves and
can I respond, Gary? Maybe a few thoughts. And thank you all for your tremendous talks today. As usual, I've learned so very much, and it's really, really fantastic what has been pulled together here. To me, and I know I come at this from a different perspective than some of the panelists here, I think there's kind of an unnecessary divide between the, for lack of a better term, reductively rational documentary drive to question and establish as firmly as possible any kind of link that has been identified between Rembrandt and the Jews. And there's no question that this has been romanticized, exaggerated over time. But to hold that together with what is extraordinary, Gary, you're saying it's great that some Christians embrace Jews. Not that they ever probably embraced Jews as Jews, or didn't have the construct that Jews really need to convert, right? They're living in blindness and sin. For their own salvation, they need to no longer be Jews. But if we can somehow hold both of these things simultaneously, and that was sort of how I answered my own dilemma with the talk that I gave, that yes, there is the rigorously historicist approach that we all as historians must prioritize. But it is not the fullest answer, because we can never fully, in fact, conceptualize, understand the complexity and nuances of what was going on at the time in the 17th century. And the potential transcendence of Rembrandt's works is also a factor that I think is not merely to be rejected as pure anachronism. As I said, it might be within the realm of possibility to imagine, as has been said for other works of art, an anachronic status, not anachronistic.
Well, I mean, that's what we want to do in the exhibition. We're giving all room to transhistorical and anachronistic interpretations and leaving them on their own terms. So I'll go with you there. And about the historical stuff, we can fight in the backyard, in the back alley. Shelley?
Yeah, I just want to continue with Michael on this too. And I think that what we have to remember is that the point of view is Christian. So they're approaching Judaism from a Christian point of view. Now, one way to understand their origins and the Jewish background to Christianity and Jesus as a Jew. The other way also is conversion, of course, because our idea today, and I'm writing about this now, this issue of toleration, is that you accept people for what they are. That did not exist, except maybe in Gaspar Barlaes's comments, though I could go off on him because of what he covered up about Maritz when he wrote that encomium to him on Brazil. But anyway, the point of view is that of a Christian. And so that, I think that's what I was trying to get across, that is the agenda. But for Rembrandt, there's always a curiosity with everything that he does. If he reads a text, as I wrote about the Lucretia, I mean, he really goes into it in a very, almost as though he was experiencing the same thing. He's very open emotionally. So all of these factors really tend to encourage this idea of the Romanticism, that he loved Jews. I think that he was open in the sense of wanting to understand them, but I don't see philo-Semitism there at all.
I see.
In fact, it's
Mirjam
pretty
has raised her
anti
hand.
when you get to the New Testament.
Okay. Mirjam has raised her hand. You have to unmute yourself, Mirjam. Yeah, there you are.
Thank you all so much. I mean, just this last week, I'm so looking forward to these Mondays and so openly discussing with all of you so many complex issues. And well, today's lectures, each of them gave me such a lot of inspiration, I want to say, and a lot of great insights. I don't know where to start first. I thought maybe it's first good to say something about what Shelley said about how should we perceive collaboration, you know, between a Jew and a Christian and an artist and a Jew, or what is that relation? And Michael, of course, did a lot of work on that. A question that keeps going through my mind is this is what I've been looking into about collaborations. What can we envision about the collaboration between Jacob Jude, for example, with Borel in building the temple model, making the Mishnah? They each had such a different approach from a very diverse point of view, but they had a mutual goal. The mutual goal was from Borel's side, from the Christian millenarians, to create a new Jerusalem. From Jude approach, from a Jewish, they had the same goal, but with a complete different. They certainly didn't agree.
The goal was to bring the Messiah to earth. And the other side was going to have the surprise of their lives when he showed up. Mm-hmm.
So because they were completely didn't agree about what would happen, but they had the same mission.
Okay, Mirjam, I see Larry has put up his hand. I'd like to.
But may I translate this into what's going on in Amsterdam? And I feel this was what is going on in Amsterdam, also from political and economical viewpoint. It was like it was. People lived together. They set aside their differences because they had certain goals they all wanted to achieve.
Yes, there is a phrase that was coined by Willem Vrijhof, which is sometimes hard to appreciate at full value. I sometimes kick against it, but he talked about everyday ecumenism. And that is just all of the groups, not just the Christians and the Jews, but the Reformed Jews and the Catholics and the Mennonites and the Lutherans and the Armenians and people, and even some Muslims, just getting along together from day to day in Amsterdam. A very valuable thing, which I would certainly not ever put down. Okay, Larry? Unmute yourself, sir.
Others have raised some very important points already. First of all, the use of the word convivencia in Laurence's talk puts one in mind also of the world of Jews under Islam in Spain, which has often been mythologized into a kind of golden age. Probably relative to Amsterdam, it was more tolerant than Amsterdam was. But it also has been justly criticized for being overly rose-colored. And some of what we're talking about, especially in the contrast between the two exhibitions, is the difference also between the literal documented world and the world that one reads in a slightly more poetical literary or visual form of interpretation. That is to say, if we think about the documented Rembrandt versus the Rembrandt that speaks to so many people, documented Rembrandt was a louse who was involved much too often in litigation. And the Rembrandt, the poetic Rembrandt that has been so warmly praised over the centuries for his love of humanity and so forth, is quite another character. But the tension between them is one that's very similar to the one worked out in the two exhibitions. But I also wanted to point out, in relation to what Shelley and Mirjam raised, about the importance, especially of the millenarian trends. And of course, they started from different points of view, but the intensity of that longing is still shown in Amsterdam in the Sabbateism, the passion and hopefulness of Sabbatai Tzvi as possibly that very Messiah who was coming. And on some level, the emotional stake in all of that for both sides of the fence was extremely high, although much higher, I think, for the Jews. And one last remark, it's interesting to hear Michael talk about this issue 20 years after his own very, very important book. And, when I first read Michael's book, I thought that all things are relative. The difference between Leiden and Amsterdam is quite stark as well. And, if you look in terms of the way the Jews were treated, we can be grateful for small favors, but just because Jews weren't outright persecuted doesn't make it a world of philo-Semitism, another term that was much too often and casually used, 10 or 20 years ago. So
we've again we're stuck in Rembrandt's time and the Jewish-Christian relations there. Anyone have anything to say about those marvelous, the Samuel Hersenberg and Kitai and or the Rothschilds? Anything about later collecting and later artists? Shelley, you're muted.
There I am. I want to thank Larry because I thought that was such a great talk. And the Gottlieb was really fascinating to me because the part that's about Rembrandt was the opposition of the Jews, the opposition to the Jews. And I was wondering if you could tell me more about Gottlieb and what he was trying to do, because I see that as very anti-Jewish. So I really want to be given more context for him.
Well, first of all,
wonderful talk, by the way.
He started in a very academic world that was fundamentally Polish, and so he knew he was speaking to a Polish audience, as well as forming his own identity as an artist in the first place for a larger public, but also a Jewish artist who wanted to show Jesus as a Jew to help reconcile. Think about the current denial of the Holocaust and everything else in Poland, especially under the present government, and the degree to which that long and fraught history has been one of unrelieved tensions. And Gottlieb was trying to bridge that enormous gap as a Jew, as an artist, and as someone who read the Bible with a great deal of sympathy. So to make Jesus into someone who suffered, which he claimed Poles did as well. And in the 19th century, there was no Polish nation. He was also a Polish nationalist and patriot in that vein, as were many of the writers of the period in Poland. So he was, in many ways, a kind of advocate for toleration of the kind that you were speaking of, not existing in Rembrandt's time. He died at age 28, so the entire program that he may have devised was limited. But as I understand it, from the list that Gary sent out originally, his self-portrait as Ahasuerus is going to be in the exhibition, and that's a very good case because it is a self-portrait on the one hand in the guise of someone who was meant to be ultimately, at least at the end of the Book of Esther, a warm and sympathetic host to the Jews, a tolerant one. Now, some people have wanted to interpret that, though it has a crown, as the wandering Jew, Ahasuerus. But I don't think that's the case at all in the case of I think Gottlieb too was somebody who took his Bible seriously and was speaking to Christian readers of the Bible, but also as a Jew, seeing the kind of commonalities that crossed over.
So you think his audience was Christian rather than Jewish?
Mostly.
Okay.
But he had Jewish patrons. I mean, what we know of the people he made portraits for, they were often political leaders and prominent people who were non-Jews. So we certainly know that he reached out to them as well. But he obviously had some Jewish collectors, and perhaps Nina can tell us more.
Larry, I want to thank you so much for your insightful lecture, because I mean, you gave such perspective and much to say about. While you were talking about Lieberman, I was remembering something I ever found, but I can't find it back. But I remember that I found a source, I think in a Jewish newspaper, that Lieberman came to Amsterdam and basically hired a room in the Jewish neighborhood with a curtain so he could observe Jews.
Yes, he has a wonderful, very broadly painted small picture of the open market in the Jewish neighborhood, and he did paint a number of works that were based then. He went to Holland several times, and he and Israel's were extraordinarily close.
Yeah, I think he or Israel's or another artist hired a room for him with curtains in the Jewish neighborhood, so he could observe Jews.
I heard that too.
Lovely. Hey, Steve has his hand up. I'd like to hear what he has to say.
I actually have a couple of questions. First, for Laurence, I'd like to pursue this question about whether the Rembrandt etching is of Manasseh, but I need to go back and look at Adrie Offenberg's series of articles in Vrijdagsgewand, because I thought he made a very strong case, and not just on purely visual grounds. But my two questions are for Gary and Larry. Larry, the Herzenberg picture of Spinoza walking in front of the rabbis, to me, that's the second worst illustration of Spinoza in history. The first being the one that has Spinoza, a blonde Spinoza, sitting on Uriel da Costa's knee.
Yeah.
Which incidentally has been attributed to Gottlieb.
Yes, that's right. Oh, I hate that one. And
fortunately, it's lost.
But the Herzenberg picture, one might suspect that this is somebody who is not fond of Jews because of the great caricature of those, a very ugly caricature of the men in the background. What do we know about Herzenberg's own Jewish sensibility? And my question for Gary is that German text you were reading to us from early in your talk, you stopped just before the sentence about Spinoza. And I didn't have time to go ahead and see what that was about. So I was wondering.
Okay, I'll send it to you.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I had to cut it somewhere, and
you cut it Spinoza, of course.
Laurence has her hand up.
Just two short remarks. It's funny because I think that Chagall is the only modern artist, Jewish artist, who dedicated so much work to the Bible. There is not another example. All the artists from the École de Paris, none of them were interested. And if you go back to Lieberman, for instance, it's the same. So this is important. And the most incredible thing that Chagall, when he was commissioned to work on the Bible by Vollard, and he used a Bible by a Protestant Louis II. And it's only after many years that a friend of him, a Patoshu, gave him a Yiddish Bible by Yoash. It's really funny. We have quite a kind of symmetry or post-symmetry. And the other question is for Larry. What about Hermann Struck, who was so, I mean, Rembrandt was his idol, and the same as Liebermann was in Amsterdam, and we know many engravings of the Jewish market. But Hermann Struck in the engravings, Rembrandt is everywhere.
Yeah.
And even he copies Rembrandt sometimes.
I'll have to look at that. I have a catalog of his complete work. No, I'd love to have it. I'm sorry I left him out. I mean, look, you know, even in the paper where we have word limits, we can't be very comprehensive. But you're right. Hermann Struck is a major artist, not so often acknowledged because he's a printmaker, but I make a living off of reviving printmakers. As far as Stephen's question is concerned about Hirschenberg, he did quite a number of images of observant Jews in their Jewish environment. And I showed you very briefly the Jewish cemetery, which is in the Paris Museum. He emigrated he also died quite young. Being Polish and Jewish is probably a curse, but he went to Jerusalem and was head of Bezalel there for a year. So this is somebody who took his religion very seriously indeed. And also, he's one of a number of artists in the Russian-Polish Pale of Settlement milieu who made images of pogrom suffering and Jewish martyrdoms and plight. So the emotional connection was also very strong in him. I hope that answered your question.
Questions in the chat, and there was one about assimilation, whether I was considered Mark Somberg of the desire of the collectors I spoke about to assimilate, and indeed Langbane reacted specifically to assimilation, and as we know from later events, this was something that was equaled out. Any Jew of the blood was Jewish. So assimilation was a move that backfired against Jews who thought they were becoming less Jewish by becoming more German.
But certainly the House of Fragile Things takes that up quite seriously, and so does the recent book by Delheim, which I think is really quite good as well, about Jewish dealers and collectors in the 20th century.
Tell me, what's Delheim?
Yeah, I have it right here. It's called Belonging and Betrayal, How Jews Made the Art World Modern.
Oh, wow.
Brandeis University Press, practically the ink is still wet. But it's a very good study. And it because it also talks quite a bit about dealers and the collection of old masters and Duveen and that side of things, but also the dealers, like Picasso's own dealers and others in Paris who were fostering modern art because it was even more accessible for them to break into, as dealers in various other things, to become dealers in art and prosper.
Leah, do you have any questions in the chat or a Q&A that should come up now?
This Nina wants to ask.
I have a question for Larry. Larry, you've enumerated artists and you positioned Rembrandt's impact on them. For the majority of these artists, it was obvious, so with the exception of the wonderful Gottlieb, where there were certain iconographic ties. This Jewish Christ, that's something that's coming across very clearly because Renard's publications from the 19th century, who made Bible a reality, had an impact on an entire generation of artists. But my question is as follows. Lieberman, Israel's, they have this perception of Rembrandt that was articulated not only by artistic ties, but by biographical facts as well. Is there anything like that on Gottlieb, something similar? Because thank you so much for introducing us to his art. It's a really wonderful artist. But are there any facts that would confirm that there was admiration towards Rembrandt? In fact, did he talk about it? Was it verbalized? Were there any actions? Were there any diary entries, perhaps, or notes from him? What made you think that Rembrandt was a source of admiration for him?
Good questions. He didn't leave a great deal of writing behind that I've seen, and unfortunately, I don't read Polish, so there may be things that have not been translated. There was a very fine exhibition, in fact, at the Israel Museum back in the, I would say, around the late 1970s. And there's also a biography of him by Ezra Mendelsohn, also published by Brandeis University Press, which is now about 20 years old. And Ezra could read Polish. He was a scholar of Polish history and Polish Jewish history. So there may be some things in there. I'll have to go back and check those sources to be a little more precise. But and so he doesn't do what some of the other authors I did that I talked about, who in some ways use words as much as paintings. I mean, the person who praises Rembrandt the most, but whose influence I don't see in his art is Pasternak, who wrote a book, a small study of Rembrandt himself, but Leonid Pasternak.
I'll be talking about Chagall and Pasternak next Monday, so I will withdraw my question.
Yeah, the other person who, of course,
I will talk about Chagall in detail.
Good. Well, another thing that I think is important for Stephen to take note of is that Antokolsky, the great sculptor from Russia who made a very substantial career in Paris, has a carving of Spinoza in a meditative pose in a chair, which is in the Russian Museum in St. Petersburg. And so Spinoza was not only important to Hirschenberg as a kind of model for a pioneering free-thinking aspect of the Jewish traditions, but was
I looked up the line about Spinoza in Langbane, Stephen, and what he says, he's just said that individualism is the sin of sins, and then he says it was not even forgiven Spinoza by his own co-religionists. That's what, and he might be right.
So as you can see, Spinoza becomes, like Rembrandt, a kind of 17th century Dutch, model or poster child for
by being lifted out of his own environment.
Right.
We understand Rembrandt so much better than his contemporaries, his narrow-minded contemporaries do, and we understand Spinoza the way those Jews couldn't. Okay. Let's have one more question.
May I pose a question to Gary, because we didn't really go in yet enough into Gary's lecture.
Yes, I think so too. Tell me, what do you want to
know? Because it was brilliant. Anyway, but I'm your co-curator. But you really gave a lot of food for discussion. And your lecture combined with Laurence's lecture reminded me of something that I completely forgot, that when we were compiling our exhibitions and we were taking loans from Jewish lenders, there was an issue about the titles of the paintings which we would present. For example, we had loans from Bader, Alfred Bader, who was completely convinced that the picture that we lent from him was a Jew. And I want to ask you and Laurence, because I remember that having to correspond with him and to negotiate that we would present the picture that you showed a study, I have it right here, study of an old man. Well, Bader himself had another title for the painting.
Well,
and
we were.
How did you do it?
I was ready to accept the titles under which the lenders wanted them to be shown. I have no problem with that. It's certainly for this exhibition, in which the choice of the Jewish collectors is paramount in our in the way of accepting and asking for loans. Talking about loans, by the way, Larry, I was really delighted that you talked about the Chagall Bible, because we don't have any Chagalls. We've been trying right and left, and maybe Laurence can help us. We have these French owners, and So anyway, the Bible we can always find. We can borrow that from a library. We can buy a copy somewhere, so we'll be able to show Chagall. Okay, listen, one more question, and then we're going to let the audience go, and the panelists can stick on for a while among ourselves. One more question. Laurence?
Gary, there is a question from the public
interesting
about
one.
Abu Warburg's Hamburg highly important lecture in 1926 on Rembrandt, which was a clear answer by a Jewish-born German scholar to the nationalistic cult of Rembrandt by Langben and contemporaries. So,
Laurence spoke about that lecture. Do you want to answer? What is the question?
There is no question that our Andres
We're
Renier
ignoring Abbey Warburg.
We ignore this lecture.
Yeah. Well, is there a lecture by Abbey Warburg? No, it's a lecture by Panofsky.
No, Panofsky. Erwin Panofsky.
Yeah. She's probably confusing the Rembrandt study by Panofsky, which was eventually published even in English in 1969, 1932 lecture.
Actually, maybe we're wrong, that there is this person is pointing out a 1926, not 1921 lecture by Warburg.
Yeah, I don't know that one.
Let me see.
I can say.
Am I right that Rembrandt experts seem to ignore Abbey Warburg's Hamburg highly important lecture in 1926 on Rembrandt, which was a clear answer by a Jewish-born German scholar to the nationalistic cult of Rembrandt by Langben and contemporaries? Charlotte Scholl-Glass wrote a brilliant book on Warburg and anti-Semitism. Well, okay, Andras, we're including Warburg in any case in the Musée, in which he devotes really extensive attention to Rembrandt images in a number of his themes, and about the lecture and Charlotte Scholl-Glass's book, I will be looking for it and will be in touch with you about it. Okay, we have to say goodbye now after now at 8:30, after 2.5 hours, for which we thank you all so much for your attention, sticking with us, and the panel is going to hang around a little while longer. So I'll say goodbye now and ask Kate to start closing down the connections of the audience. Thank you all very much.